looking back on it of, all the games and films I played up to that point, I was like, oh yeah, it's the animation that really like drove me to appreciate those things and make me to connect with those characters or those stories and stuff. So
we've been called a lot of things. And we're inspired by everything around us, including each other. The individuals that have inspired me the most create beauty and positive change. To me, that's the highest form of art, and it deserves the loudest praise. This is Shout Out, the art of self-expression.
On this episode of Shout Out, the very talented principal animator, Chip Carle.
I did a lot of motion capture early on in my career, for Red Faction and Tron and a couple of the other cinematics, and a lot of that was incorporating motion capture and establishing cameras. That is a lot of creative freedom that we have on the team, and specifically as an animator, like that's where I get to help define that, and like we get to look at the gameplay's perspective and figure out the best way to represent those creatures. My childhood obviously was the Disney movies, the Nintendo, Mario, and Duck Hunt. I played the hell out of that. Kind of part of what finding the right feel for animation is, that perfect balance of expression and timing and feeling of exaggeration and emotion and all of that, and capturing that correctly in a game can be difficult.
Chip Carle, how have you been, man?
Hello. Good. It's been a long time since I've spoke to you.
Yeah.
Good. How are you?
I'm good. It has been a long time. So we have a lot to catch up on, because I think 2008 was the last time we chatted, and that was like graduation. Kind of looking at your LinkedIn profile, it looks like you've had a kind of a wild ride. You've gone from Blizzard to ILM X Lab, and now you're at Wizards of the Coast. How's that journey been?
Yeah, it's been very interesting. So 2008, I think 2009 is when I actually got started in the industry. So that journey has kind of been a very interesting learning experience, just going through the different types of animations, the different development teams, different styles, different approaches, different relationships. Like it's been exactly that. It's been a journey. Like I feel like there's been these different like milestones and like light bulb moments in my career ever since, and I'm sure even in school, you have those same kind of moments of when you learn something and how to apply it. And then once you get, in the industry, it's just taking that and applying it in like a real project that's going to have impact. So it's been really fun.
So just because we both went to the same school, how close to the environment that you're in now, how close is that to how school was?
Well, that's difficult to say, because like the environment right now, especially with COVID, is like so different.
Right.
It's very remote driven, but yeah, like the overall environment of like the day-to-day like just development of games, I would say it's similar, but there's so much more nuance to it that you don't learn in school. And I think especially in school, there was still a lot that was left to be explained in the sense that like a lot of people were still trying to understand their own discipline deeper, and how to like get someone to pay you to do that full time, and let alone like once you go down that path, expanding beyond that to be able to like relate to all the other disciplines and stuff has been like the most important journey to me. I think I went off a little tangent there, but yeah.
It's okay. I'm gonna just warn you right now. I am the worst at going off on tangents. I think it has something to do with just being creative in general, that you start making associations really quickly. But you touched on something that I'm kind of fascinated with. Kind of diving into the discipline itself and going through school. I'm kind of fascinated because you were doing animation like as your focus in school, correct?
Yes, but not from the very start. Like when, at least in the computer animation course at Full Sail, it was tailored a little bit more towards cinematics. Like we only had a few classes on game engines, um, so it yeah, it was it really depended my initial focus was really just to understand how games were made. That was my biggest curiosity. But
Yeah.
then really quickly I realized that my favorite aspect, or what drove me to enjoy video games the most, was animation. So like I really just hooked on to that to understand that more. But yeah, like the I would say like the second, or like the last two-thirds of my education was very much focused around that and computer animation focus.
Now, was your kind of realization, your light bulb moment of animation being the thing that tied you into games, did that happen while you were going to school, or was that like right before you chose to go to Full Sail?
Um, but it was it was something that I was aware of, and it was something like I knew the process of. Like I had looked up like the principles of animation, and I understood like modeling and texturing and all the various things that went into it. But I just didn't understand like what would really align to me. Like I was like 17 at the time, so like I really didn't understand like uh exactly what the how to do these things at the highest caliber. So as I started to understand that, and to like listen to guest speakers and understand like what it takes to really master this art, that's when animation really, I looking back on it, of all the games and films I played up to that point, I was like, oh yeah, it's the animation that really like drove me to appreciate those things and make me to connect with those characters or those stories and stuff. So yeah, well, once I had that, and I wouldn't say it was like a literal like a flip of a switch moment, but like as I went through those journeys, and specifically like having classes with some of like the old Disney animators, some of the professors that they had there at the time, like that was really inspiring to be able to understand like how expressive you can be in so little frames, and like how far you can push things um artistically with just posing and motion and timing. So yeah, I fell in love with it.
What are the differences between game animation and cinematic animation?
um so the biggest difference I would say is the how responsive it needs to be. So it really comes down to like actual player input, or like AI driven animations. The way that those flow through state machines is, you have to author those animations very differently, and sometimes to a specific camera angle, or any camera angle. Like if you're doing like some isometric game that you can tumble around, or if you're doing like a virtual reality project where the player is the camera and they could be anywhere at any time in that project, um, you know, establishing animation, either pipelines or posing, silhouette, all those principles for those different projects, it applies very differently. So yeah, for cinematics, it's a lot of stitching all of those pieces together to tell the bigger story, and a lot of that um, comes across from the storyboard onwards, and is kind of tied more toward the script. And you'll have those cinematic animations within games, of course, like, you have God of War or whatever, and it ties in gameplay and cinematics gorgeously. But um, the main difference I would say between gameplay and cinematic animations is that need for responsive timing. And like when the player presses a button, the pose needs to be quickly what is going to represent what the action is going to be, and that quick anticipation and things like that.
Are you working on like one single game, or are you kind of asked to shift between multiple different games and different perspectives and how to look at the animation like you were talking about?
Um, yeah, so right now I'm working on Magic the Gathering Arena. I'm only working on that singular project, but it's interesting because there's lots of every time there's a new set for Magic the Gathering that comes out, there's either new perspectives and new creatures, characters, cards that come into play. So it's our kind of artistic take on that what that accessory or what that pet or what the card or effect is going to be. So in that sense, it kind of changes it up and has different projects, but the actual project as a whole is still under the umbrella of Magic the Gathering Arena. But we have lots of interesting creatures and things to work on that change within it. Yeah.
How often do you get to kind of just put your own take on what you do, or is it laid out like we want this kind of animation and just execute?
Um, so here, that's part of what drove me to come to this position specifically is there's lots of that creative freedom where we're tied into gameplay in some ways, and there's reactions for the creatures in the game, and like you can click on them and stuff like that. But the actual design of like, what how this creature is going to react, how they're going to stand, what interactions they'll have with the cards or during gameplay, what types of accessories will be available to that as you unlock it, like we have like essentially a mastery track, so you can like have like a version 1, 2, and 3 of a similar pet. So like those kind of decisions, that is a lot of creative freedom that we have on the team. And specifically as an animator, like that's where we get, or I get to help define that. And like we get to look at the gameplay's perspective and figure out the best way to represent those creatures. So like for like Dungeons and Dragons set, we did an actual dragon pet. So like there's lots of like interesting things that the dragon can do. It can breathe fire and roar and things and stomp around. And so it's thinking about those type of behaviors and executing on them and making sure that the rig is going to be available to do those type of movements and things like that.
I remember in school, it seemed like they were trying to reinforce the idea, and I remember seeing it, in behind the scenes at like Pixar movies, that if you're going to animate, you also have to be kind of versed in acting. How often are you using yourself for reference?
Um, Often, yeah, like daily, ideally. Like, but it really depends on how often I'm actually filming myself. Probably not as often now. It's like for Wizards of the Coast, specifically the jump here, there's lots of non-humanoid creatures. So, you can't really film yourself as a dragon, but you can act yourself out, like the timing of it and stuff. So a lot of times I'll just stand up in my office here and just block out the timing mentally. Like I'll just close my eyes and walk through the steps of like how heavy the step should be, the left and right, or what type of timing I want for the wings to flap and things like that. I will actually do quick recordings, and sometimes it's not literally me acting it out. It's like I'll take a video of my hand of like me just trying to get like the timing like that, and then I'll just like reference that and just have that on my other monitor. Little simple things like that. Or if it's like either gifs or videos of other creatures. So it's really a combination of like filming myself and finding other inspiration that's going to be the culmination of what I want this creature to be. But specifically for like cinematic stuff, yeah, it's critical to do reference video. When you get this towards motion capture, especially, like you'll have shot cameras that are capturing the actors, and you'll want to punch in on that and like actually look at the actor's face as they're going through those emotions, because that's like an excellent point of reference. If you are not actually acting it out yourself, as another layer on top of that, or maybe they didn't have a good take or whatever. Like a lot of times you have the mirror on your desk, you're looking at yourself or recording that. I haven't done a lot of the facial animation in the last couple of years, but yeah, that's a big part of it.
Two questions come to mind. What is the most fun you've had um, animating? What was that character? And what is the most interesting reference you've had to use on a project?
I'd have to say it was for StarCraft, StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void. That it was a really interesting project, and I would say Artanis is the character. It was, leader of the Protoss, and uh, the way that we use his animations across, gameplay and cinematics was a lot of fun. Like he had a dynamic kit for his gameplay animations. That was actually mostly animated by our other animator at the time named Ming. But the cinematic stuff was a really interesting approach where we would do more elaborate, like A-level shots where we spend a little bit more time nuancing on the characters or having them walk by the shot, and just making them visually more interesting. And then other like C-level shots where we're doing kind of machinima level stuff where we're just taking snippets of other things, walk cycles, and just stitching them together, just to like have background characters and things like that. So it was a really interesting project to kind of see through from the start to finish.
Okay. Now, the other thing that came to mind when you were chatting before is, you had mentioned using your hand as reference, which I think, that makes sense to me. But for someone who's never been exposed to animation, they're like, what? What is the most interesting thing you've had to use for reference in animating a character?
So some of that's tough. There's not too many like unusual things. A lot of like substitutes when you're just trying to figure out how to move something that's heavy. A lot of times, like I'll just put a heavy weight on some unusual part of my body. Like if something needs to limp or is carrying something heavy, putting something heavy on the right side of your body, like carrying a cinder block, is something that, like, instead of a suitcase, like just walking around with that heavy cinder block in my hand as if dragging a chain type of a thing. Um, Trying to think of other specific examples. Like for on the Diablo projects, I was animating one of the goatmen sorcerers, and they walk with like we tried multiple different walk cycles actually, of them like running with the staff a little bit more like eager, like almost joyful. One where he's like corrupted and like limping on the staff. So like I was like actually acting that out of like putting heavy weight on this object. Like I think at the time it was like some giant wooden bow staff that they had in like a reference room at Blizzard or something like that. So I would say actually that bow staff and like how we tried to incorporate that staff into the kit of the goatman was probably the most interesting like reference that I shot.
Done a lot of like motion capture. How does that work in like a game environment? Do you guys have actors that are hired in and brought in, or are you guys putting on suits, or like how does that look?
I did a lot of motion capture early on in my career, like for like Red Faction and Tron and a couple of the other cinematics, and a lot of that was incorporating motion capture and establishing cameras for pre-rendered content. But how motion capture is utilized in games can be very different. Uh, a lot of times you can chop it up into pieces that is utilized in when I was talking about earlier, how gameplay and cinematics are different. Cinematics, you'll have like a long take of motion capture where you just have that actor, and you can kind of take that as a whole. Whereas you have these kind of pickup shots where you are taking actions of a character and breaking them down into their pieces so that when you have the player's input, ultimately in the end, it's coming back together. And so motion capture in that sense, you have different relationship with different actors. Like um, for StarCraft 2, we actually did a tiny bit of motion capture, even though that game, nothing in that game is traditionally motion captured, but we used an Accent suit just to capture a few background characters, which was just myself and the other animator Meng putting the mocap suit on and capturing ourselves using tablets, walking around, reacting to explosions, things like that. And then we kind of stitch that back in. And then you have the more like cinematic motion capture, which is more like what I did at Industrial Light and Magic, where or ILM X Labs, where they would have hire in professional actors to go in and to do um, all of the body acting for that. Yeah.
When that data comes in, is it like, how does it look? Is it just like tons of keyframes, or is there a program now that like kind of smooths that out so it makes it easier for you guys to receive it and kind of, do your own thing with different parts of it?
Yeah. So it really depends again on the studio itself on how they're going to ingest that. Like you have the basics down to where, and we did this at ILM X Labs as well, where you have a virtual reality setup and you're actually just capturing like the motion of your VR hands and then retargeting that onto characters, and then baking that back down and kind of working up from there. That's more of just like a prototype phase. But so there's so many different levels of motion capture. Um, Generally, like for the higher quality, like higher content stuff, you have that super high fidelity mocap that's going to go through like a technical team that understands how to capture the best quality content with the right setup. So typically, by the time it gets down to the hands of the animators, it's already been retargeted so successfully that it's really just the animators needing to put their artistic touch on it, not necessarily fixing issues like pops or bugs or anything like that.
Right.
It depends on the budget of the project, I would imagine, on how many people you can get involved to up that quality from the actual what you capture all the way down to what you finally work on, and depends on how many middle people you have in there.
So when it does get down to the animators and you're talking about, you're kind of just adding polish, is it kind of just like flourishes and secondary actions, that sort of stuff that you're focused on, or is it what does that look like?
So it really depends. Um, for an example of using motion capture in more dramatic ways, I was really early in my career. I worked on the Tron video game for I think the Xbox 360. This was like the first thing I worked on in 2009. Um, and that was again like we were given motion capture data of someone like an actor walking up to a wall and jumping off of it. But what they that data needed to represent was something more superhuman. Like that person needs to not just put one foot on the wall. That person needs to run up exactly this many game units. It was 256 game units, and then land on the other end of that. So like if you look at the actual data and you look at what
Yeah.
the final result needs to be with all the exaggerations and flourish and stuff, they're two drastically different things. So that's one where it really depends on like what was captured initially, and if you have control over that. Like if you're just an associate or whatever, and you're just you're handed data, you kind of massage that the best you can. And at the time, like I ended up essentially stamping out poses of that data. Like his approach to the wall was great. His like his compression down before jumping up to put his foot on the wall is great. But most of the stuff after that had to be keyed in, like him reaching with his hands. That wasn't a part of the original mocap shoot. So like that all has to be layered in. So it's using motion capture as like a sense of timing and a guidance, but exaggerating it heavily. So, and then you have the other side of it where it's like one to one, like it's exactly what the director intended, and you have a huge prep time leading up to that shoot, just like as if it's a movie. Like it's shot like in camera. This is exactly the data that we want with all of the tracking and super high fidelity. Um, or yeah, and there's a huge range of what's applicable to different projects.
What's the thing that you love the most about what you do?
I think figuring out exactly that, like what's most applicable to the project, like what's because each project has slightly different solves or different people or relationships that you need to work through. Like with gameplay, you need to focus a little bit more on like how the actual player is going to be involved in that animation. Like when they press the button, how quickly it needs to hit the pose so that they feel that it was responsive. Like sometimes you'll hear words like the game felt sluggish, and part of that is if you lean really heavily into beautiful fluid animations, it can feel a different way. It will look a certain way, but feel different to players. And finding that right balance for each project is really fun. Um, so I think that's the coolest thing. And even if my involvement in a project has been strictly cinematic, there's still other ways that I feel like that I've been involved as an animator that's been just genuinely fun, and talking with other developers and like learning their processes as well. So I think, yeah,
It
a lot of learning.
it seems like, and you touching on the sluggish and like the speed, and games tend to move so rapidly, and even the characters move so much quicker than in reality. And I can imagine, um, you know, studying motion the way we did in school and then getting out, that had to have been a little bit of an adjustment. Um, or was it because you'd played a lot of games? What was that journey like?
That's a really good question. So that's kind of part of what finding the right feel for animation is that perfect balance of expression and timing and feeling of exaggeration and emotion and all of that, and capturing that correctly in a game uh, can be difficult. The main difference, and I think the learning curve from doing that is knowing what frames matter and how to author the pieces, knowing what the end puzzle is going to look like. So sometimes that can be difficult when you have something that has like a full move set, or if you're working with a designer of like how a creature is going to behave, understanding the flow of all of those mechanics and all of those animations and how the player is going to perceive them is the biggest challenge. Versus when you start off in school, a lot of what you're focusing on is just that one little segment of what's going to feel good on your demo reel, and like, oh, this one piece looks really beautiful. It becomes trickier when you have hundreds of pieces over lots of time, um, and lots of different people in game engines, and you add all this other different levels of complexity. So I think um, that learning curve is the complexity that goes into doing it in real time.
So I don't think we got to dive too much into like your kind of early story. Can you kind of tell me where like all the inspiration came from to get to where you're at right now?
Sure. Um, so uh, early inspiration. The biggest things that got me into it were in my childhood. Obviously, was the Disney movies and early video games. Like where I guess early for me was the Nintendo. Mario, and Duck Hunt and stuff like that. So I played the hell out of that. I enjoyed the Disney movies. I got emotional watching them as a kid. I was always amazed at the worlds they built, and as I got older, like into middle school, I was got more and more curious about how it's actually done. Like I just I never put a face to art. It was always just like it's just something that exists, like the stuff on the bus or the stuff on the magazine or whatever. Like, but I just want I was curious really, and I think I went to the library. Oh yeah, it was the local library. They had a subscription, I believe, to Animation Magazine or some other like PC gaming magazine. And my dad at the time worked right next to the library where I was at in middle school, so I would be there every day, and I would play games on their computers there, like literal like learning games, like learning math and things like that. Um, so that was another just intro into just more gaming things to surround my life. So I feel like it's been a part of my life even from the very early ages and like early 90s, like when PC gaming was like, you know, kind of kicking off. I was lucky enough that my dad worked in IT and we had a computer around at the time too. So all those kind of pieces coming together, Animation Magazine, like I remember seeing like the first like wireframe on Mesh when I was like 12 or whatever. I was like, oh, that's cool. Like, what does that actually mean? And then like starting to learning about vertices or whatever. And then by the time I was like 16, I downloaded a version of Maya, was rendering a cube, and I was like, oh, okay, like this is interesting. Like I want to know more at the time. Like I didn't really understand like if it could be a career or anything like that, so I was really just trying to learn more about it. And yeah, I graduated high school early to get into college early, so like at the time I started college I was 16, and like I knew that's what I wanted to do, and luckily my parents supported me, so it was nice.
Awesome, man. Um, any kind of like heroes, or you touched on like, um, you know, you love the Disney movies. Any favorite movies that really started it off? Like any like light bulb moments there?
Yeah, so I'm horrible with names, so I'm not even gonna attempt to mention some of my heroes. Like I have them bookmarked in my art details, like
Yeah.
my on the Chrome and stuff. But yeah, like some of the it's obviously very inspiring. All the original animators from Disney. Like specifically in San Francisco, they had a art demonstration for the original old men for the animators, and it was really cool. Just walking through that and seeing like their journey and seeing pictures of them at their desk drawing, and uh, at the time. You didn't I never really appreciated all the things that go into animation and the history of it too. So there's a huge amount of appreciation for the how it all started, and you can still see like how well the outline that they created resonates today. So like I think that is obviously always going to be a long time inspiration.
Do you have anybody that you want to give a shout out to?
Ooh, I only think of other animators right now.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So there's a good friend of mine. She's, I believe, lead animator on Diablo 4 now. Karina Kingdom. She is amazing. I started working with her in I think 2012 when I was working at Blizzard, and we kind of overlapped a little bit on projects. And she has a really amazing perspective. She interned at I think Disney for a little bit doing some 2D stuff, but before she's from Australia, and then she came out here, and now yeah she's been crushing it out here. And yeah, I can't talk enough good things about her. She's amazing. So shout out to Karina.
All right. Well, thanks so much for sharing your insight and spending time here, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure.
Shoutout is an Ellering Stories production. For more episodes, visit elleringstories.com.